In June 1937, Benito Mussolini moved the Italian fascist position on communism closer to that of Hitler. Mussolini declared that Bolshevism represented a civilizational threat to Europe that only fascism could resist. Something is being formed, a kind of European idea born of the notion that one danger alone menaces our culture, our integrity, and our civilization. This danger is Bolshevism. Similarly, Mussolini, in reference to the Spanish Civil War, in which the fascists worked to destroy the threat of communism, declared that thousands of Italian fascist volunteers have fallen to save Western civilization, and this attitude was repeated by Fascist Italy's aristocratic foreign diplomat Count Ciano, who stressed that Italy and Germany were to collaborate to safeguard civilization from the Bolshevik menace. Now, Hitler had long connected the threat of communism to the impure racial menace of the Jews with his concept of Judeo-Bolshevism. Jews and communism were combined together within the narrative of a foreign threat that's seeking to infect the pure German nation. Thus, it needed to be stomped out entirely. And in 1940, Hitler ranted. I think it was Mussolini who declared it was a ranting. Hitler apparently ranted to Mussolini that Bolshevism was the doctrine of those people who are lowest on the scale of civilization. Within classical fascist thought, whether Nazi or Italian, anti-communism plays a central raison d'etre, preached with an almost religious fervour. The threat to Western or European civilization was emphasised, and its racial impurities, the communist racial impurities through association with Jews, was frequently invoked by the Nazis. So, it's more than a little bit concerning to see Trump's White House launch a bizarre and likely significantly AI-generated attack against Cuba as a central node of the race communist threat against not just the US, but Western civilization as a whole. In terms which echo both Mussolini and Hitler, this new report from the State Department concludes that Cuba's assault on the United States was never at root a quarrel over economic policy or sovereignty or even ownership of a particular territory. It was a revolution against Western civilization itself, waged in part via the novel and insidious method of persuading the children of the West to turn against their own inheritance. The consistencies between this example of modern anti-communism and the anti-Judeo-Bolshevism of Mussolini and Hitler are quite clear. Communism represents more than just some sterile economic threat, but an attack which goes to the very soul of white supremacist civilization itself. But while the racial enemy for Hitler was Judeo-Bolshevism, for Marco Rubio and the State Department, the enemy is Antifa, terrorists with links to Palestine, and significantly, the Black Radical Racial Revolution, or to put it in the words of noted small-faced weirdo James Lindsay, race communism. That is, despite Cuba's position as a Latin American revolutionary state, this report relies on existing anti-woke, anti-IDPOL, anti-critical race theory discourses, and claims that Cuba is pushing a specific race communism based on the twin pillars of black radicalism, but also, as an indication of what they consider targets for repression, it's also frequently associated with terrorism, Palestinian terrorism. Now, while I want to make clear that so much of this report is obviously just bollocks, it's filled with lies and bizarre framings, and clearly Cuba is not the centre of a super powerful global communist conspiracy, because if it was, you would think they would be able to get the brutal blockade lifted. Instead, that blockade has only intensified as the US continues starving the population, causing blackouts and deaths. The US is murdering the Cuban population, it's strangling it. So with the assumption that this report is largely just bollocks, what is it actually for? So I think, firstly, it's laying the groundwork to justify an invasion of Cuba. But more than this, it's creating a civilizational enemy consistent with Nazism and fascism to justify the internal repression of dissent and the deepening of fascism. Throughout the report, Cuba's ties to Palestinian solidarity are emphasised over and over again, alongside its apparent role in, quote, pro-terrorist rallies on university campuses. And this is an extremely clear indication of just who is being lined up for repression, who will be vulnerable to extreme policing or McCarthyist witch hunts. But it's also impossible to miss that throughout the report, black radicals are held up as being a particularly insidious agents of Cuba's race communism. Figures like Assata Shakur, Kwame Ture, or as the report says, Stokely Carmichael, and Angela Davis are provided as the sort of nodes of race communism infecting American civilization, and their sanctified position amongst various different strands of the broadly defined left is cited as proof of the level of civilizational threat that they represent. And all of this is tied together in one big terrorist-shaped bow as both Palestinian liberation and black radicalism are lumped together as Antifa. And as we all know, Trump has declared Antifa a terrorist organization, despite, or maybe because of, how nebulous Antifa is.
Antifa is going to be designated a domestic terrorist organization. The president intends to sign that executive order very soon as it's drafted, as soon as today, later this afternoon. And this is something the president campaigned on because we have seen a rise in violence perpetuated by Antifa radical people across this country who subscribe to this group. And we will also be, most importantly, looking at who is funding Antifa and who is funding these other violent left-wing groups that we've seen perpetuate so much crime and mayhem across our country.
And this means that both anti-ICE protests and anti-Cop City demonstrations can be lumped together as Antifa, the result of an insidious Cuban race communism, and therefore justifiably brutally repressed. And we can already see the impacts of the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group in the repression of protests in the US. 8 people have been sentenced to between 30 and 100 years in prison for an array of charges, including aiding terrorism for taking part in action outside of an ICE detention facility. The inclusion of terrorism in these charges comes after Trump proscribed Antifa as a terrorist organisation. And this is pretty significant for the deepening of fascism. As Adrian Lyttleton points out, the limitations on the right to strike throughout the liberal period in Italy made the transition to fascism smoother. However, even these continuities may be seen as not truly decisive compared with the change represented by the effective suppression of almost all possibility of protest against administrative injustice. The use of terrorism to clamp down on dissent can clearly be seen as part of the general movement towards total fascist hegemony, and this only becomes clearer the deeper you get into the reports. Marco Rubio's personal vendetta against the Cuban Revolution is only part of the story here. The threat of race communism has apparently been projected by Cuba throughout every single part of the US state, and therefore the repressive measures that emergent US fascism can justify are expansive. The total clampdown of any dissent against administrative injustice is expansive. The State Department even accuses legal observers at protests of being Antifa stooges pushed by Cuban race communism. And legal observers are a crucial part of any demonstration. They ensure the police don't attack or violently abuse protesters beyond the bounds of the law, but according to the State Department, guild lawyers serve as an on-demand jailbreak force capable of providing immediate support for arrested rioters and militants, mobilising a network of bail funds and allied NGOs to secure their quick release. The Guild has played a similar function at many of the most significant far-left uprisings of the past decade, from Standing Rock, where Guild lawyers travelled to North Dakota to provide on-the-ground legal support in over 800 criminal defence cases, to the Antifa-led Stop Cop City riots in Atlanta, in which NLG legal observers were reported to be amongst the militants who were charged under Georgia state domestic terrorism law, although a Fulton County judge later dismissed the charges. Attacking legal observers as stooges of race communism, tasked with getting criminals and terrorists back on the streets, is clearly an attempt to, as Lyttleton would argue, effectively suppress almost all possibility of protest against administrative injustice. The invocation of the racial communist civilizational threat is invoked for some dirty, nuts and bolts repression. But it goes beyond just repression of protesters. Importantly, the construction of race communism follows the long-standing battle lines along which contemporary fascism is appearing, some of which have been gladly promoted by liberals and some on the left.
Hassan Piker was dressed like Mao.
Namely, the threats posed by terrorism, by Palestine, by wokeness, as exemplified by BLM, the New Left, and elite college campuses, by Twitch streamers like Hassan Piker.
Dressed like Mao.
And can I please get included within the regiments of global communism? I'd do my bit. And even the DSA is being held up as a vector through which racial communist threats are being projected. And for all of these examples, you could find countless liberals who would swear up and down that they are a threat to the health of the US nation, especially if we think about Palestine.
There is a small group of far-left extremists gaining influence inside youth groups and party organizations, and they are going to abolish the police and abolish borders and abolish prisons and play them on a loop for 6 months. Democrats must act now and intelligently. We've got to make sure that we don't allow that party, if it is the vessel, at least for now, to something better than what Republicans are offering, to be hijacked. I see you, really, when people ask me, who do you see right now as the sort of progressive that you like to be at the head of this movement going forward, I think of you, and there's a bunch of different reasons why. And unfortunately, there is right now a bit of a division, as I see it, on the left on a number of issues. That includes foreign policy. Certainly, the Israeli-Gaza situation has brought this into the forefront for a lot of people.
There's even a parade of dipshits, anti-woke so-called leftists who continue to back up bullshit narratives about the apparent pervasive power of IDPOL throughout US universities, and therefore feeding into the emergent fascistic narratives that this report exemplifies. And in fact, The Atlantic, moving away from leftists back to liberals now, The Atlantic has just published a piece arguing that the DSA is a subversive internal threat to the democratic establishment through its support of Cuba and of Palestine, and that it seeks to push politics towards identity politics, isolationism, and hostility to capitalism. The Atlantic piece really echoes the State Department so much that I wouldn't be surprised if it was written with some coordination. The DSA are framed as elite, IDPOL-obsessed Stalinist anti-Semites who are pursuing entryism to corrupt the great American institution of the Democratic Party. They're a threat which, according to this article, are deserving of a McCarthyist purge to save the soul of American civilization. Riveting stuff. Following the fascistic lines of the State Department as well. But neither the anti-woke leftists nor the establishment Democrats and media arms are going to be made safe from fascistic purges by finding lines of agreement. According to the report, the tentacles of this simultaneously super powerful but also incredibly weak Cuban communist enemy, another classic fascist construction, spreads across the institutions of the modern American left in its universities and its non-profits, its street movements and its media. That campaign has enjoyed a success its founders could scarcely have imagined. The regime's method was never primarily premised on kinetic warfare, although it was not above utilising violence and terror when it suited its interests. It was subtler and far more dangerous. To attack the United States not from without, but from within, to turn Americans into instruments of their own nation's undoing. Following classic fascist lines, the report is basically creating a nebulous threat of the internal enemy, which allows the administration to conduct a witch hunt against anyone they perceive to be a threat.
Hassan Piker was dressed like Mao.
In the report, this covers the DSA, Mamdani, but also universities, and also the heights of the democratic establishment itself. It's implied that Obama is implicated in this Cuban scheme. The Democratic Party, the American establishment, somehow in cahoots with Cuban communism. Of course, this would allow Trump's State Department to launch a witch hunt against even anodyne political enemies, like the Democratic Party. In the context of a historically defeated labour movement and little resistance from the liberal establishment and parts of the left, This sort of shit is deeply worrying, especially if we follow Polantz's argument that fascism can only fully appear in moments of historic defeat for the left. Race communism is unfortunately not happening. Fascism might be. Before I conclude with some reflections on what this report might actually mean for Cuba, it's worth highlighting again the civilizational white supremacist discourse that underpins this report, the one that draws it so close to 20th century fascism. And while the report is filled with examples of Cuba supporting left-wing insurgents against American-backed right-wing dictators, frequently again invoking Palestine over and over again, each of these instances of support is incited as proof of its global racial communist reach. But maybe the most revealing example of this is when the report condemns Cuba for supporting revolutionaries in Rhodesia. And for anyone who doesn't know, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was an explicitly, constitutionally white supremacist state which brutally suppressed its black population and has become a kind of, North Star for global white supremacists. Remember Sargon of Akkad, early right-wing YouTubers? He had a video called The Tragedy of Rhodesia. So when this report highlights Cuba's support for Rhodesian revolutionaries as evidence of its insidious anti-civilizational race communism, it's making a pretty explicit invocation of global white supremacy, a real tip of the hat to exactly the kind of fascist ordering that the White House is pursuing as it entrenches its contemporary forms of fascism. I do also think it is notable that throughout this report, third worldism and anti-imperialism are similarly invoked as part of the anti-civilizational threat of race communism. This obviously fits within the notion that black radicalism and Palestinian solidarity are the twin figures of fascist focus, but I think it also is notable as imperialist consumption is so essential to maintaining the hegemonic status quo upon which this increasingly fascistic moment is built. And this might, in some way be a prefigurative protective measure against any movement pressure to break the US away from its imperial mode of living, especially as climate breakdown continues. And while their more immediate threat is probably just the racially inferior global south, that global racial ordering is foundational to the imperial mode of living. So, we can't neatly separate these different strands of discourses. So, this report uses Cuba to construct an internal racial communist threat, which justifies extreme repression of political enemies and undoubtedly makes the transition towards fascism smoother while reinforcing racial nationalist and civilizational myths which have long characterized fascism. But it also clearly exists as a threat to Cuba. The US's brutal blockade against Cuba, which began in 1962, constitutes the longest and most extensive system of unilateral sanctions applied against any country in modern history. It has long stifled Cuban development. Despite some limited softening of the embargo by Obama, largely in terms of culture, banks in fact faced larger fines for working with Cuba under Obama than its predecessors. In his first term, Trump instituted over 243 new coercive actions, including over 50 during the COVID pandemic. And rather than reversing these, and despite clearly being an agent of Cuban racial communist brainwashing, Biden added sanctions of his own. It's also worth noting that some of the cultural softening of the blockade included university exchanges, which were explicitly used as a tool by the US state, along with a bunch of subversive efforts pursued through USAID. USAID was used, again, we know it was used to try and topple the Cuban government. Part of the softening of the blockade included cultural exchanges with Havana University. The US government was trying to subvert the Cuban Revolution through these cultural exchanges. This report uses those cultural exchanges as evidence in a topsy-turvy way of the Cuban communist threat projecting itself through elite institutions. So it's completely against reality. It's a complete upturning of reality, but is used, like the very means of America's own imperialism is being used to justify further fascistic embeddedness and fascistic ambitions. But returning to the economic blockade, in 2018, the National Association of Cuban Economists calculated the cost of the US blockade at $4.4 billion annually. That's $12 million every day. And the cost subsequently rose due to the Trump measures. In 2022, Cuba estimated the cumulative total cost at over $154 billion over 6 decades, and the daily cost at $15 million. Current energy embargoes are causing blackouts across the country, including in hospitals, where people are undoubtedly dying. So the US is currently engaged in more than just economic instrument for regime change, it's conducting a brutal war against the Cuban people, a siege. And this report, I think, lays the groundwork to transform this siege warfare, which is starving the population, into an active military invasion. If we look back to the history of 20th century fascism, Mussolini's initial view of communism was of a purely internal threat. Once it was put down within Italy, he pursued some tentative attempts at diplomacy with the Soviet Union. And it wasn't until Hitler began pursuing military expansionism that the Italian fascist view of Bolshevism as a civilizational threat truly accelerated. And I think we can see the acceleration of fascist civilizational panic through this report, and my big worry is that it is a sign of the US's increasing intent to invade the island directly. And clearly, while this would be an utterly disastrous move for one of the few dwindling lights of socialism left in the world, I doubt the US would actually sustain an invasion. Whatever Marco Rubio believes, the population of Cuba will never welcome the US as a liberator, no matter how much they starve them and blame it on the regime. Despite marketizations and the threats to Cuban socialist potential, the revolution remains extremely popular. The US will never be welcomed, but will always be rejected and resisted, and they will find it impossible to hold a hostile population hostage. So, my fears from this report are really twofold. Firstly, it demonstrates the further fascistization and repression of internal enemies of the US state, while reinforcing white supremacist civilizational narratives that are so common to fascist hegemonies. But secondly, it is a dark omen for the Cuban people, who have been stalwartly resisting US imperial aggression for decades and are currently suffering under siege warfare. As much as the State Department's report is filled with horseshit, one thing that is inescapable as you read it is just how important Cuba has been for oppressed populations across the globe. Whether that is sheltering black radicals from assassination by the US, or training revolutionaries against white supremacy in South Africa and Rhodesia, supplying medical aid across the world, and being a light of inspiration to radicals for decades. Cuba has shown revolutionary solidarity, and it's important that that solidarity is returned, whether through flotillas or through resistance against fascism at home. Once again, down with fascism and viva Cuba. Alright, thanks for watching. First things first, I've included a link in the description where you can find information on how to provide any sort of financial solidarity towards Cuba if you have any extra money to give, and I would recommend checking that link out as they resist that brutal siege. If you have any spare cash left, or if you feel like you want to support my channel, please go to Cuba first. But this channel can only survive with the generous contributions of the audience, and you can either sign up to Patreon for as little as $2 a month, where you get early access to videos and scripts, or you can sign up to $5 a month where you get access to a Discord server, or $10 and up where you get access to all of that, plus your name's read out in the credits. I appreciate any support I can get, and it really does keep the channel surviving and, me surviving. I also have one-off donation links as well if you're interested. And with that, I will read out the names of my beautiful patrons. Hopefully you just didn't hear that car horn that blared out. I'm not going to re-record this because I don't want to. I'm tired, it's Sunday, I'm hot, I want to watch a movie or go for a walk. With that said, thank you to my beautiful patrons. First of all, to Demo Squid, Sovel Hayes, Anita Inespe, Bon, Cameron Blakemore, Daniel Swing, Earl Grey T, Ellis Wren, FT Signifier, Hey Joe, Joshua Moldenhauer, Catherine Helm, Kate Marshall, Kim Crawley, Nina G Public Relations, S, Stephen Van Doren, Unoriginal Name, Violet, Beans, Aga Ghost, Aaron, Alex, Borland Rice, Cade Soiree, Christopher Puff, Daniel Hughes, Duncan Skinner, Esoteric Fictionalism, Eugene K, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jack, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Joel, J.R. Barbera, Caspar Gundy, Westberg Larson, Kieran Gore, Layum, Mason Colbert, Mark Gusty, Neil Zabelgard, Patrick Mackey, Paul Singleton, Fia Westphal, Practical Woman, Rachel Ann, Rachel Mixon, Robin, Tamash Kisbeter, TB Skyen, Tim, Tinfoil Pancakes, Tom Price, and Xander Corvus. And yeah, thanks again for watching, and I will be making a video on Andy Burnham and whatever bullshit is going on with British politics in a wee minute. For now, I'm going to put this out. It might be a couple of weeks before I get something else done. It is an anniversary of a bad thing coming up, so I am taking a slight break, and I also have a million other things to do, including finishing my own book, finishing about 3 other papers that are due, and contributions to other works. So much unpaid work in academia. Jesus Christ. Sorry, I'm getting backtracked. Out of track. My brain's melted. I'm going to say bye now. Love you. Bye.